their job.
And does it take an exceptionally generous employer? I'm not talking about the cost, because the program might cover that, the extra cost, but it's a little bit analogous to other situations where they tell us, for instance, this is different, but I'm going to say the analogy anyway, that you should try to hire ex-convicts, because they'll become convicts again if you don't. If you don't get, nobody gives them a job, that's where it ends up. And so in the case of these kids, are there employers out there who are nice enough, quote unquote, to give them a try?
There are. And you know what it takes is a couple of employers, a couple of businesses to model that it can be done and that it can be done well, and then other people are more open to doing that. But you have to start with somebody. There's actually a wonderful company here in Birmingham that was family owned, has grown. They have about 100 employees, and at any given time have 8 to 10% of their employee base of people with disabilities. And they have an occupational therapist on staff. And
what does the company do?
They are a mass mailing company. They, next to the post office, handle more mail than anybody else in the state of Alabama.
And so they are able to, at the skill level of some of these kids, they're able to give them tasks?
Exactly. So they have young adults, 21 and over, that they work with. And then they also have some older adults that they work with. They have 2 individuals that have autism. They have 1 man with a severe hearing impairment. They've had employees that have had strokes that have returned to work. Their occupational therapist looks at their worksite accommodations and makes those accommodations for them if they need it. They might need some type of schedule for the day if they have cognitive issues, just something to kind of follow and keep them on task. So it's companies like that, I think, that really set a nice model for others to look at and look to if they're interested in doing that.
And in some cases, you might even get qualities you wouldn't find in your regular Joe.
Absolutely.
Who's just thinking about, emailing his buddies or to get a beer at the first chance. I mean, they might actually be, in a sense, more hardworking or more loyal.
Absolutely. And if you ask the president of that particular company, she would tell you that her employees that have any kind of special need are some of her most devoted employees. And she has a good number of employees that have been with her for 20 years or more. And even with that, many of her employees with disabilities are some of her best workers.
And I was talking the other day to somebody who takes care in a facility, a spectacular facility really here in Birmingham, called UCP, right? Am I correct?
Yes.
United Cerebral Palsy. And he was pointing out they have all ages there.
They do.
And he was pointing out that when we think of family, and it's a daycare center. It's not. They don't overnight there. But he said, as they grow older, it becomes dramatic because the family is older too.
Right.
The parents might be 80.
That's right.
What happens in situations like that?
Well, it's an interesting phenomenon because a lot of therapists like myself, we get into the work of pediatrics when we're young, and we enjoy working with children. And the one thing that we find over our own years of work is that those same children continue to grow older just like we do. And so while I love working with babies and toddlers and young children, I also have loved in my years watching those children grow up, because the Down syndrome, the cerebral palsy, the genetic disorder, whatever it is, it doesn't go away. So there was that 3-year-old with Down syndrome that is now 53 and still has Down syndrome.
Yes.
And they have a totally different set of needs. So it's nice that we have here in town places like UCP that have programs for individuals, young adults, or children of all ages. But the burden is also very much so and very present for the family members, because, as I mentioned earlier, once you turn 21, then there are not a lot of services available to you. Well, nothing really has changed magically between that 20th and 21st birthday.
No.
It's just that there's no legislation in place for anything to still continue. So you have to be very resourceful, and you look to a lot of nonprofit organizations. VSA Arts, you look to the Exceptional Foundation, you look to UCP of Greater Birmingham.
But is there an attempt, because it struck me you were saying earlier, teaching somebody like that to write a check, to lock their doors, I guess, and not leave the stove on, things like that. Is there a movement to try to make them autonomous? I'm sure that's not possible in every case, but is it possible in some cases?
There is, and I think the best hope for that is if school system therapists are looking towards that independence, that level of independence for whatever kind of independent living or semi-independent living that person could have once they graduate from school. So in those last few years of school, that would be an important time to capitalize on those skills. And then a lot of these programs around town would also work on that. I know Gary Edwards, his program at UCP, in their adult program, they spend a lot of time on independent living skills, on cooking and making beds and just safety skills. You know, what happens when somebody comes to the door? How do you know if it's a stranger, or how do you know if it's somebody that you want to invite in without just opening the door? So yeah, I mean, there is an emphasis on that, and that's obviously the stuff that parents worry about too.
For sure, when they're no longer there.
Right.
And can I ask you, we're always asking people, you know, their most memorable encounter. What is your most memorable encounter with a child that you can think of?
Oh, I guess my most memorable encounter would be a time that I went to a preschool classroom with, I was actually in the capacity of a volunteer as an animal-assisted partner. I have a King Charles Cavalier Spaniel. I actually have two, and they're both registered as pet partners. And I had one of them, my oldest Cavalier, with me. And we went to a preschool class with about 5 children in it. And there was a little girl that was sitting in the classroom that was selectively mute. And she hadn't spoken in months. Had a very long history of neglect and abuse. She was 3 years old at the time. And she was very observant. She watched me, she watched my dog, she watched the other children. She didn't say a word. She didn't make a sound. And kind of the protocols, we went in and we would sit on the floor and the children would come up to my dog and I, and they could look at her photo book and they could help brush her and they could pet her. And the little girl sat on the outskirts, on the periphery, and she watched everything. So our 30 minutes was over. I got up to leave and all the other children were petting my dog, saying goodbye. We walked by the little girl who never joined our circle, and she reached her hand out and touched my dog Mia and said goodbye. So, and that, to my knowledge, was the first time the child had spoken in, like I said, these many months. Now, was that the presence of the dog? Was it just the day that she was going to speak? I don't know, but it was pretty powerful.
Yes, that's what counts.
Yes.
Dr. Rowe, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Dr. Jan Rowe of the University of Alabama was our guest this week on the Hidden Angels series.